Hi, I am Dr. Felice Gersh, your integrative OBGYN physician. For this Instagram, we are going to talk about a topic that I have previously been discussing, but I definitely need to talk about it more. There are so many questions that have been asked about Bi-Est. Well, before we get into a deep dive about what is Bi-Est, I need to do just a quick overview of estrogen. Now, for many of you, and I hope this is the case, you already know a lot of what I'm going to tell you, so I won't make it too long. Estrogen is not a hormone. It is a family of hormones. And not only is it a family of real hormones, they're actually, well, I'll call them intruders. They're just like, usurpers of the term, but they are technically endocrine disruptors, man-made chemicals that can in some manner bind or react with estrogen receptors. Well, what about the real, we'll call them the real human-produced estrogens? Well, in an adult female, and we're going to stick with females for this conversation, there are three types. There is E1, just like the B vitamins. Estrogens have a big letter, E for estrogen, and then a number, 1, 2, and 3 for human adults. So E1 stands for estrone, E2 estradiol, and E3 estriol. Now, there is an E4 estradiol, which is a fetal estrogen, and I'm going to devote an entire presentation down the road, not too far down the road, to estradiol. So for those who have submitted lots of questions on that particular estrogen, do not fear. I definitely will cover it. Now, but getting back to the three ones of the adult female, the one made by the ovary is E2 estradiol. And that's really important to remember because there are different estrogen receptors. Now, we did not know this, and we're still learning about them. We did not know this until relatively recently. Now, when I say recent, I mean like in the 1990s. Sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. So if I have to pause, give me just a second and I'll get my act together here. I left a drink, but I left it in another room. Now, when we talk about estrogen receptors, there are three main types. There is alpha and beta, and then the membrane receptor, the G-coupled protein receptor. I call it GPERS, G-P-E-R-S. Now, if we look at the alpha has a discrete distribution, and it is found primarily in the brain, in the hypothalamus part of the brain, whereas it is also found elsewhere in the body. There is no place that has just one estrogen receptor. There are always a multitude, but there can be a predominance. In the brain, other parts of the brain have a predominance of the beta receptor, and the GPERS, the G-coupled protein receptor, is distributed everywhere, it seems. Now, these different hormone receptors create different effects in the body, and that's important to know. That's why you need E2 estradiol, because estradiol binds appropriately as needed to alpha, beta, GPERS. Now, E1, which is estrone, binds almost exclusively to alpha, and estriol binds almost, but not completely, exclusively to the beta. Now, different cells, as I mentioned, and different tissues have a different propensity distribution of the different receptors. Now, when you look at the immune cells, and this is really important when we talk about pregnancy and estriol. So in pregnancy, the dominant estrogen made by the placenta is estriol. Now, estradiol is also present, but estriol is very, very dominant and huge quantities compared to any other time in life. Now, on the immune cells, now this is not exclusive, but the dominant receptor On the innate immune cells, these are the ones that act as the first response to a pathogen or to damaged tissue. That particular one is alpha. So those immune cells are called mast cells, neutrophils, macrophages. So those are the ones that are the first responders of the immune system. Now, the cells that make antibodies, those are predominantly endowed with the beta receptor. Those would be the B lymphocytes. Now, one of the actions of an immune system's activated inflammatory response, which is a product of the innate immune cells, which are predominantly alpha receptor positive, are pro-inflammatory cytokines. Now, cytokines include things like tumor necrosis factor alpha and the interleukins and interferons. And these are the types of products, these pro-inflammatory cytokines that are blocked by drugs that are called immune modulators that are given to women. Predominantly 80% of autoimmune diseases are in women, for treatment of autoimmune diseases by blocking those cytokine, either the production or the action of those pro-inflammatory cytokines. Well, it turns out that estriol E3 does that. That's part of its natural response by activating the beta receptor. And when you have a lot of activation of the beta receptor, it also actually downregulates the alpha receptor, which is the receptor that is on the innate immune cells that activates the inflammatory response, which we need. It's life-saving. If you get infested, as I did, by some kind of virus, if you get an infection, you want those innate immune cells to come right to your defense and immediately start killing, and then gobbling up those pathogens. But what we don't want, of course, is for them to do that inappropriately, which is what is happening when they produce pro-inflammatory cytokines in the context of an autoimmune disease. We don't want to be destroying ourselves. We don't want to be harming our own tissue, but that's what happens in autoimmune diseases. So that's why it's such a big thing, this breakthrough of treatment with immune modulators for diseases like rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis and psoriasis. Okay, so these are really breakthrough drugs, and our own immune system is affected by estriol. But in an adult, healthy, reproductive age woman, we do not have a lot of estriol. We have predominantly estradiol, which also converts to estrone. So you can have a back and forth conversion between estrone and estradiol when you have a normal environment, and the body does that as needed. And a small amount of estradiol can go down a pathway, which it does, to be transformed from estradiol into estriol, from E2 to E3. And this happens when the body wants more E3, okay? So in a healthy reproductive aged woman, you would have a perfect balance in the body of estradiol made by the ovaries, converted as needed into estrone and into estriol, all controlled by the body, and you don't have to think about it, fortunately, because we wouldn't know how to do that, right? If I said, please make more estriol, you wouldn't know how to do it, but your body does when you're in the reproductive age group. But good to know, if you give estradiol to a postmenopausal woman, you give bioidentical E2 estradiol transdermally. Guess what happens? It will, and there's published data on this, it will convert to estrone as needed and to estriol also as needed. You don't have to think about it. We just give what the body makes naturally during the reproductive years to a postmenopausal, and we supplement with a perimenopausal woman, and the body does its own thing. All we have to do is make sure we have the right nutrients, we get enough sleep, we don't poison our body with too many chemicals from the environment. We do all the lifestyle stuff to give our cells the capability to do what they're designed to do. And we don't think about it. When we eat food, we don't think about how that food is acting when it's converted into the micronutrients that are part of it. We don't think, I wonder how I'm going to use my vitamin A in my body today, or my B12. We don't think about that. We're not supposed to think about it. If you give the body what it needs, the miracle of life is that it does what it's designed to do. And that's what my job is as a physician, is to help every one of my patients and help you to know what you can do to enable your body to do what it's supposed to do. Now, some well-meaning people years ago, under the auspices of trying to do the right thing, and I totally respect that. This goes back to the 1960s. What was found, and even before that, into the 1950s and then into the 60s, they found that when they tested women with breast cancer, and by the way, they at that time didn't even know, like I said, they didn't know there were different estrogen receptors. They just knew that there were these different estrogens. And they did know that estriol and estrone are weaker estrogens and have a shorter lifespan, okay, a half-life that's shorter in the body. This they knew decades ago. But what they didn't know is how they bound to receptors and how the receptors interacted and which cells and which tissues had which receptors predominantly. They didn't know any of that. But what they did know was that there were 3 estrogens in the human adult female. They knew there was estrone, estradiol, and estriol. They knew that estrone and estriol were weaker estrogens in that they had less binding ability. They did not bind as powerfully to the receptor, but they only thought there was one receptor. They didn't know what was going on with the different receptors. They also knew that estriol had a shorter half-life. When estriol was made in the body, it did not stay in the body very long. It would be gone. It would be gone very shortly. And so it did not hang around very long. So they did realize that if you gave estriol, and they could manufacture and give it, isn't that amazing? They could do that decades ago, that it did stay in the body a relatively short time before it was gone. But what they did when they did some measurements is they found that women with breast cancer had lower levels of estriol in their urine than women who did not have breast cancer. They had no idea why that could be. This is back, decades ago. All they knew was what they found. So one doctor named Dr. Wright, he came up with this idea. Well, why don't we give estriol? That's actually interesting, but not an acceptable conclusion, because if someone has less of something, we don't know that that's a cause of something or an effect of something. I mean, they had no idea. Well, now we know so much more, but we didn't know that then. But we do know that there is, and I'm going to talk about this, a potential role for estriol given to women with certain medical conditions. I bet you're already guessing what that could be just from what I've already told you. Okay, so, and I'm going to get back to pregnancy because that's a very unique time. And the last thing we want to do is try to recreate the hormones of a pregnant woman in a non-pregnant postmenopausal woman. That would be as illogical as you could get. So, but getting back to decades ago when Dr. Jonathan Wright came up with this idea that you could give estriol and also estradiol to a woman, that maybe you would create a protective environment and she would be less likely to get breast cancer. Actually, we don't know that. Okay, we have no data, and I have done exhaustive research on this topic. But if we think about what may cause women to have a lower estriol and this is not like this has been replicated a lot or anything, but why could a woman who has breast cancer have a lower amount of estriol? Well, it could be because she has things going on in her body creating a great deal of inflammation. We now know that breast cancer is a very highly inflammatory cancer, and it triggers the production locally in the breast of estrone from androgens from the adrenal gland. We also know that when you have high levels of inflammation in the body, which women with breast cancer generally tend to have, because inflammation from a variety of causes underlies the very development of breast cancer, inflammation causing DNA instability and breakage. So you have an inflamed body. And remember, the biggest risk factor for postmenopausal breast cancer is inflammation related to obesity. So if you have a very inflamed body, and we did not know this decades ago, it actually blocks the enzyme that can convert estrone to estradiol, because those two should be able to go back and forth. But when you create estrone and you have a lot of inflammation, it downregulates the enzyme, so you get stuck in estrone. And if you're stuck in estrone, then you'll have the inability to convert it to estradiol. And of course, in a postmenopausal woman, you don't make estradiol from the ovaries because they're not making anything at that point regarding estrogen or progesterone. So the ability to convert the estrone is very much hampered because of inflammation. And it's from estradiol that you make estriol. So if you have a lot of inflammation, think about this. If you have a lot of inflammation, you're going to make substantial amounts of estrone by converting with the enzyme aromatase in breast tissue and fat tissue. Stroma and fat tissue and breast tissue readily make estrone from androgens coming from the adrenal gland. And then you are stuck with a body with a lot in the breast of estrone, E1, and the enzyme to transform it to E2, and then from E2 to estriol, down regulated. So then you would have less estriol, you would have more estrone. And then you would find that you have less estriol in the urine of those women. But that's not what caused anything. That's a response to, that's a function of having breast cancer, not a cause of breast cancer. Now, that said, let's look at what has actually been found in terms of what Jonathan Wright proposed, which was to give a combination of estriol with the dominant estrogen in his combo, being estriol, and then a lesser amount of estradiol. Now, initially, he also gave another product called Tri-Est, which was a blend of estrone and estradiol and estriol. And that long ago fell out of favor. So I'm just not going to get into Tri-Est. Okay, so we have Bi-Est. Now, there are many doctors, both MDs and a lot of naturopaths, and I love them. These are my friends, okay? So they are very well-intentioned. So I don't want to talk about them. They are really good people. But I just don't agree, and I want to give you why I don't agree with using Bi-Est as a hormone replacement therapy for menopause. And I'm going to talk about why estriol may have some specific uses in medical conditions, not as hormone therapy for menopausal women, but basically as a drug therapy. And that's okay. I'm totally for helping people. That's my mission in life. So getting back to Bi-Est. So what was concocted, and I have to say concocted, there was no scientific data, no research, nothing to say that this was right, better, or anything. It was just based on this hypothetical from the study that showed less estriol in the urine of women with breast cancer. That was all that this was based on. Now, but what they concocted was, in almost all cases, there are variations, but we'll talk about the majority, an 80-20 ratio, where 80% of what's in this cream, it's typically given as a cream, topically, and it's made by a compounding pharmacy. They combine a ratio of 80-20. 80% is estriol and 20% is estradiol. And what is the dose? Well, it's whatever is decided by the prescriber. So the most common that I have seen in my practice from people coming through, and I have prescribed this myself. I want to be telling you that because I was taught that this was good by compounding pharmacies and lectures. And it's only as I learned more and more about what estrogen does, the different types of estrogens, that it was evident that, well, you mean well, but this is not the right choice, okay? Just not, and I would not recommend it from this point and previous points forward. So the most typical dosing that I have seen is 1.25. That would be 1 milligram of estriol and 0.25 milligrams of estradiol. And some people give it once a day, twice a day. If someone is getting it, they really should not get it once a day because it has a short half-life in the body. By a few hours, pretty much all of it is going to be out of the body. So you're not going to have much. If you put it on in the morning, as you approach the late afternoon, there isn't going to be any in you. So that probably would not be the ideal. If really with estriol, because it has such a short half-life, it would be ideally given 3 or 4 times over 24 hours, but I've never seen anybody do that. But realistically, it does have a short half-life in the body. Now, there are other people that have given smaller doses, like 0.625, and then 20% of it would be estradiol, and 80% would be estriol. And I've also seen 2.5, and I think maybe once or twice I've ever seen anything higher. So, and the 2.5 then would be what? It would be 80% of that would be estriol and 20% would be estradiol. So here's the thing. Is it dangerous? Probably not. So I have to tell you, it's probably not dangerous. We have no real data. But here's the thing. If you don't give enough, first of all, there is no human time in life. There is no female that ever in her life, at any point in her life, will have a ratio like that. Never. I mean, there is not in pregnancy either. Okay, this is not, and why would I want, I'm going to talk about this, why would I want to mimic the hormones of a pregnant woman in a non-pregnant menopausal woman? That makes absolutely no sense. So the bottom line is this is concocted, it is made up, it is not based on any clinical data or science. I mean, I am totally open-minded about everything. If people can send me studies, I went on PubMed, I went on Google Scholar, I could not find any good published data. Now, what I did find was that there were some studies that showed that when you gave estriol, now this wasn't Bi-Est, it was estriol. When you gave just estriol, it did not prevent fractures, okay? That's predominantly because the beta receptor is not a big player in bone health. It's predominantly alpha, okay? So it did not prevent bone fractures. There was one tiny Japanese study of like 12 women that did show that over 5 years, there seemed to be reduced bone resorption. So, I can't say 100%. That's all the data we have. It's like really, really minimal. There has been some studies showing not a lot at all, very minimal, that women on estriol, I could not find any research with Bi-Est, but on estriol, just estriol, that they tended to have a higher incidence of developing endometrial, that's in the uterine cavity on the lining, polyps. So uterine lining polyps were increased. What else? There was one study that for women on estriol alone, for at least 5 years, they actually did develop a higher incidence of endometrial, that's uterine lining, adenocarcinoma. But once again, very small data. Now, what we do have is data showing that if a woman is pregnant and she has her own natural hormones produced, which includes a lot of estriol, she is very likely to go into remission if she has a certain one of several types of autoimmune diseases, including psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, and multiple sclerosis, among others. Okay? So what is that about? Because in pregnancy, you have all that estriol to downregulate the alpha receptor. The alpha receptor, as a quick reminder, is the dominant one on the innate immune cells, the innate attack cells of the body for infections and for damage, but also for foreign bodies. Like if you had an organ transplant, well, guess what a fetus is? It's like an organ transplant. It has protein antigens that are foreign to the mom. She would never have those proteins because they're coming from the dad who has different genetics. So in order to keep the mom from rejecting, like an organ transplant rejection, her fetus, the immune system is modulated, down-regulated to keep that from happening. But as a consequence, women have a lowered resistance to pathogens. So that's why pregnant women are more likely to have adverse outcomes if they get infected with things like COVID or chickenpox or the flu. They tend to have worse outcomes because their immune system is down-regulated, their innate immune cells. And if you've ever watched cable TV and you see the ads for these immune modulator drugs for psoriasis, for these autoimmune diseases that involve arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis and psoriasis, like I mentioned that, and other types, and multiple sclerosis as well, then what happens is they have warnings, big warnings that they have to announce that don't take this if you have an infection and you could have a fatal cancer develop, like a lymphoma, because the immune system that looks for cancer cells appearing or pathogens coming into play, that they are now hampered. But it's a compromise that must happen in pregnant women. Does this compromise need to happen in a postmenopausal woman? Of course not. As postmenopausal women, we want to have a really strong, robust immune system. Of course. That's why they even did studies during the COVID pandemic with giving men and women estradiol to try to boost their immune system. They weren't going to give estriol, I can guarantee you that. They were worried about pregnant women with their high amounts of estriol and their altered immune systems, which are necessary in pregnancy, but not other times unless you're treating an autoimmune disease. And there are published articles utilizing estriol as a therapy for multiple sclerosis and other autoimmune diseases that are involved with pro-inflammatory cytokines that are released from the innate immune cells that can damage our own organs. So that is one potential use for estriol as a drug. They've even talked about using it in males because it is such a weak estrogen in terms of its binding to the estrogen receptor sites. But, they're looking at it as an immune modulator. Also, in Europe, it has been used in the past as a SERM, like a selective estrogen receptor modulator for treating breast cancer, because it down-regulates, when you have all that beta agonist, beta stimulation, it down-regulates the alpha receptor. Breast cancer is always alpha receptor positive when it's breast cancer receptor positive for estrogens. So yes, there can be a role. By the way, that's why they give drugs like tamoxifen and Avista. So maybe there is a role for breast cancer treatment. Maybe there's even in specific cases a role for breast cancer prevention, but not as a hormone therapy. Remember, if you control inflammation through proper lifestyle and by having a logic cyclic dosing of hormones, when you have that, you can actually potentially, I cannot prove this, potentially lower your risk of breast cancer, not increase, lower, to try to give you the same risk level as a healthy premenopausal woman. Remember, the vast majority of breast cancers are in postmenopausal women, and the vast majority of them are not on hormones. But being on hormones doesn't mean you can't get breast cancer. I mean, I wish that it was that protective, but, life is not that simple. So what else is estriol potentially good for? For vaginal health, and it's used really extensively in Europe for vaginal dryness, because in the vagina, there are a lot of beta receptors. And I do sometimes use it as a therapeutic modality, a hormone, specifically for vaginal rejuvenation, you might say, for vaginal health restoration. I do tend more than using estriol to use estradiol. Number one, it's much more affordable because you can get it as a prescription drug, and it's covered almost always by insurance coverage. But also there are alpha receptors as well. It's not pure beta. And there are alpha receptors as well in the bladder in particular. And when we now are treating, we're calling it genitourinary syndrome of the menopause. As well, there is data showing that the alpha receptor is more protective for the kidney. So I tend to use more estradiol cream, or sometimes other formats. There's suppositories and there's rings, although I personally prefer the cream, but using intravaginal. But I also do use intravaginal estriol, and once again, it has to be compounded. There is no commercial product. But I have really struggled to find any reason to give Bi-Est at this time. There is no reason to give Bi-Est. If you give physiologic dosing of the estradiol, you get the balanced effect on all the hormone receptors. And I will go over, not on this particular segment, but in a future segment, I'm going to talk about what alpha receptor does, what beta receptor does in different organs, and the G-coupled protein receptor, because I want you to understand why you want that balanced effect. You don't want to try to micromanage your hormone receptors. I'm not smart enough or capable enough, and neither are you, because we're not supposed to be. We're not supposed to micromanage things on a cellular level. We're supposed to give the body what it needs and let it do its thing. That's the beauty of life. So we can get on with doing stuff we should be doing. So please do not take Bi-Est. Please, that makes no sense. And as a sideline, in the vast majority of cases I have seen, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but in the vast majority, the amount of estradiol that is being prescribed is really, really suboptimal. It is too little. It is too little. And when you give the right amount of estradiol, it will convert. There is no data to show it won't convert to estriol. One person said, well, maybe it won't convert. Based on what? Show me the data. Show me the data. I will change my mind in an instant if you show me the studies, the data. That was not based on anything. You can't, and also data from 60 years ago, they didn't even have the same types of hormone assays we have today. It was not anywhere near the quality of measuring hormones that we have today. So I'll change my mind in an instant. I am open-minded. Believe me, I have changed my mind so many times. I am not doing everything I recommended years ago, and neither should your doctor. Say, where is this data coming from? Why are you prescribing this? Why can't I have physiologic dosing with bioidentical estradiol and progesterone? If needed, we add in other hormones, whether it's DHEA or testosterone or thyroid. Those are separate. Those are not part of menopause. Those are separate hormones that if you need them, you get them, but that's not part of menopause. Why would I give and why would you take some concocted version of a hormone therapy based on no science by well-meaning people, take and replace with what nature provided when we were healthiest, to try to mimic as much as we can, it's not the same, but as much as we can, the environment, the cellular milieu that was enabling us to be optimally healthy in our 20s. We can't do it, but we can try hard to get as close as we can so that we can be super ager ladies. So there's no data to show Bi-Est is a good choice. Is it better than nothing? Absolutely. Absolutely it is better than nothing. And I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just telling you what I think and based on the science. Now you make up your mind.